This is not mine? Yes. Okay. So good morning. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me for my first trip to Ireland, and it's a shame I come back next time on a longer time. It's a bit short today. So what I want to talk about today, I have prepared quite a lot of things. So I'll try to go through the slides and to present you a view, maybe a bit out of key of what happened, of today, about child law and the child law clinic. My topic is on a theme, children's rights studies. And I'll explain to you what I mean by children's rights studies. I think it's a subject I'd like to put on in the field to discuss about. And then, as an illustration of what I mean with children's rights studies, of its potential, is looking into the notion of implementation, challenging that notion by something else which I call translations. So that's the base. Now, to start, I'd like to use a metaphor in a presentation like this. 5 years from now, I'd like to have a book out, and I called my book Children's Rights Studies. And when you write a book or think of a book, you always start with the first page. So this would be my first page, like a cover, something. And then the rest is I still have to write it. So, but I'm already that far. Now, I very much like this image. One person in the room must know it. It was used as a publicity campaign for Ghent University in Belgium, where I worked the first 10 years of my career. So now I've moved to Switzerland and I work in Switzerland. This means dare to think. So it's made up. It's not a real family. It's just some actors standing out. But what I like in the image is that it disturbs a bit the traditional way we would look at children's rights. We would imagine children's rights is about taking care of poor African kids and they come then to Europe and be adopted or something. And in these images, at least it puts it question marks, it questions all these kind of things. So now I have a cover for my book. Now I'll try to work on a content. In my view, what children's rights studies would be about is it deals with interdisciplinarity. It is close, or it is influenced by a field that also is only emerging, which is called human rights studies, or which I would call human rights studies. And it is also linked, maybe a bit more familiar with childhood studies. So I think these three would be building blocks to look at the field, or this study field of children's rights studies. The first, it's interdisciplinary. I learned this from a colleague, Frédéric Darbelay, who works with me at the Institute, who is an epistemologist. So he's not at all into children's rights, but he works a lot on how disciplines work together, what kind of views you can have. Now, this is just a short scheme to show, you could put children's rights here in the middle as the object of our study, and then look at it from all kind of disciplinary angles: psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, legal studies, etc. So there is no limit into it. And the essence of this kind of interdisciplinary approach is that it is a dialogue, a common dialogue around one particular subject, which is children's rights. So you do see legal studies, and I think the rest of the day, I didn't succeed in preparing to see also how this would link then to child law, as you call it, to legal practices, legal practitioners. But in my view of a children's rights studies field, that would be one angle, but not at all the only one. So there's this whole discussion from all these kind of disciplines. Now, I also think we can learn a lot, or I think children's rights is, and it is often said like that, children's rights are children's human rights. So we have this field of human rights. Now, I think the last 10, 15 years within human rights scholarship, there are very fascinating new people coming into human rights studies, which was, I would say, historically lawyers interested in human rights and European Convention on Human Rights and so on. Now there's a field, the social legal studies, or even sociology of human rights. So there's anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, all getting interested into what human rights are. And they have a different kind of questions than the questions a traditional legal approach would have. So what are origins of human rights? What are their consequences in practice? So not only the legal text, but also looking at their practices and the consequences. And it is to cite here Neil Stammers, who's a political scientist who worked on social movements and human rights. This naive belief that human rights is there to challenge power, while in practice that is not always the case. Human rights are also used to sustain extant power relations, and we need to look empirically what it really does, what it ends up to do. So we have to, with Richard Wilson, who is an anthropologist of human rights, looks at this whole field of human rights, the actors. Who are these people? Who are the judges sitting in the European Court? Why do they do what they do? Who are these NGOs? Who are Amnesty? Why are they doing and how do they work? So, and the last, and I think that's a very critical question, which also is important for the children's rights studies field. That is, what is the relation between studying human rights, studying children's rights as an academic perspective, and contributing to its promotion and the protection of children's rights? And I think it's a tension we have to keep. In some papers I've written, I took a stance. I think as an academic we should be a bit more on the back and not so much on the front of trying to change the world by doing academic work in children's rights. But that's of course debatable. I know people in academia are also very much eager to help promote, to make the world a better place for children as a kind of overall. I think within academia and within this field of children's rights studies, I think we should discuss that and be very careful about this ambition also of, can we participate in the promotion? I think this children's rights studies field at least is a call to look also at what happens and who are these promoters, why do they do it and how do they work. As I said, there's a third field that is close to, or an issue that would fall into my book. This would be then chapter 3. And I put here up 2 quotes, and I like the quotes from their origins. Michael Freeman wrote in 1998 in the International Journal of Children's Rights, a journal maybe many of you are familiar with. And so he, from a children's rights perspective, he looks at the sociology of childhood and he says, well, we are both working on a similar kind of lines of thought that we think children should be, we should focus on children's agency. So that's so he looks from a children's rights perspective to the sociology of childhood. And the editorial of the journal Childhood in 1999, so in the same period, did the same, but reversely, from the social study of childhood, so from childhood sociology, pointing at the importance of the CRC and to showing that this is a similar move to abandoning a protectionist perspective towards children. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn, and to situate my children's rights studies also close to the childhood studies field. So that's my 3 first chapters. I said 5 years from now, so don't send me emails tomorrow. Where is your book? This would be a cover that didn't make it for my book. I think that's an older book. I like this picture because it allows. The anecdote, I took it from a newspaper. A few months ago, the German development or the German Ministry of Justice sent out people to Afghanistan to train them in policing techniques, in non-violent ways of crowd control, etc. I thought it was funny to see how they use also my kids' toys to discuss with these. So the people you see in the back are Afghan police, people who are trained in a police training center. It's just a nice picture. In a project I was part of when I still was working at Ghent University, we discussed already then issues about implementation. They are here in the middle. We came up then with a scheme that looks at implementation linked also to standard setting and to social reality. So you have, at the one hand, standard setting. Within the field, people would say now the phase of standard setting is over. It's time now to implement all these standards. Probably that is not the case, so that will not be the case. You know, just very recently, the 28th of February, there was the 3rd optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We continue pushing for new standards. The OPIC, which is on the individual complaint mechanism under the CRC. So the standard setting phase, but it's an important phase. And then you have the social reality. Via implementation goes the idea we want to have an impact in reality, and therefore we have the implementation. What this project when we did then added to this kind of thinking were the arrows, and showing that it is not just from standard setting, then implement, and then we have an impact in social reality, but also particular issues in social reality influence the kind of standards we want. And so NGOs, people, advocates will push for new standards, maybe also on a national level. You will have your legislation, via implementation, but you see then also the reality that maybe new standards are needed or new kind of legislative pieces of work are needed. So it's a very dynamic field, these three. And my point today, and the illustration of what a children's rights studies approach to these kind of issues would be, is to challenge the notion of implementation, which, if I take here, that's the definition taken from the General Comment number 5 of the CRC committee. Implementation would be the process whereby states parties take action to ensure the realization of all rights in the Convention for all children in their jurisdiction. It's a very descriptive, simple way of saying what is it about? It's about making reality of the human rights of children. Now this view, of course, it has many adherents, and we think that's okay, but it in some way it has a very kind of naive instrumentalist view somewhere. It's like as if this God-given text is perfect, and what we need now is to put it into practice. It only lacks political will and sufficiently economic means to put it into practice. But if we have these two, political will and means, then it will be there. This is what I hear very often, also students saying, well, we need to. Now, I think that's critical, and this very mechanical view of implementation, that's a bit what I challenge, and I think the reality is not like that. In the reality, implementation is a very contested field, and also a lot of interpretation goes into that. I have a very mean example. Again, Michael Freeman in 2007, who wrote that the case for children's rights will prevail. We have to believe this because out of it will emerge a better world for children, and this will redound to the benefit not only of children but of all of us. So I think many people in children's rights would, adhere to what Michael Freeman says. I check it with my students, and they would all say, who would agree? Yes, I mean, we want to believe. There's a kind of a belief question also in it. Now, I said it was a bit a naughty one because it's the picture that I was targeting when I had this quote. Those who don't speak French, it means buy the Mercedes because it's more secure for kids. And they put a picture with kids which were familiar for us in a child rights perspective, to say, oh, we have children, they demonstrate, they have a right to participate, they can say their things. Yeah, look, this is a car company that also knew that, and they use that for, in my opinion, not really the benefit of kids. If they are in the car and there are more cars, then it gets less safe in the end. But it's just to highlight and that these risks of instrumentalization and of pushing other values, or people put values into this whole implementation process, and it's not neutral what you are doing. Nigel Thomas wrote about these issues of participation. There has been, especially in the UK, a lot of expertise now for more than 20 years in child participation, but in the end of all these efforts of participation, where we stand is, children tend to participate at the margins, and they do not really contribute where it matters in defining the terms of policy debate. So we still have a long way to go in this participation. If you make a scheme and you look at this, what I've just said about implementation, it would be as if there is children's rights, they have to be implemented, so the yellow arrow goes down, and they need to have an impact on the ground into children's lived realities. And then there is participation, and that is within the settings of the implementation. So participation is limited to what we have decided they can participate in. And that is what I want to challenge with a notion, with current research I'm undertaking in the field of, I call it children's rights studies, and that deals with the notion of translations, where we try to challenge this simple idea of children's rights. They are just, we need to look into means how we can implement them. That would be a nice book cover, I think. The image means, it comes from my work also with anthropologists and people who work on children's rights in developing countries, where you have this idea, there's an NGO that has a bus and goes around to help the children where they are. Now, That is true to a certain extent, but the critical question here is who decides where the bus goes and what kids can get onto the bus. An example, the International Committee for the Red Cross goes to the field and helps people who have been affected by war, right? So children victims of war. Now if they pass in a village and kids are shouting, look, there's no more war here, but our teacher is beating us, we are living in a violent school system. Well, the CICR, their mission, and Henri Dunant said that they were going to help out kids who are victims of war. So they will not stop necessarily, or probably they will move on and say, well, there might be another bus coming, but when? And it's about, the image wants to say that it's very often in our organizations in control of setting agendas, of going where on particular issues. We were looking also into what do children themselves have to say about their priorities, their rights. Are they also taken into account by those powerful actors that are there to implement children's rights? But in how far are children also influencing what kind of rights that are getting implemented? I have two examples of a more empirical kind. So empirical studies that deal with this and with this whole issue of translation. The first one is a project that is still going on the international translations of children's rights. So our question was, we have now 20 years of CRC advocacy. If we look at the international agenda, so that's looking at UNICEF Save the Children, the CRC Committee, the UN General Assembly, what kind of themes have they been putting on the agenda first? Because, of course, there is the idea that all children's rights are important at the same time, this holistic thing, but we know in reality that is not working. You set your agenda, you set your priorities for the next 3 years, for the next 5 years. So we were asking ourselves, what have been these thematic priorities? And I'm not going to say anything about methods, just believe me. You have to believe me. This is a full list of the themes. Now, the 20%, I wanted to highlight here the themes that the international child rights advocacy community has been good at were children in emergencies, basic needs, child labor. These were the three main big themes. If you go through all these documents, and you have to believe me on the method, it makes sense. It's not just invented, these kind of things. What is interesting, and what this project then also did, was looking at the marginal themes, because that's interesting. Themes that are not on the agenda. You have the very last one, the right to safe abortion. It's only one line in 20 years of advocacy. So meaning young girls, 16 in countries where abortion is legal, need to have safe abortion. Nobody speaks about it. Or another example could be the right to and in underage work, which I was working on the whole movement of working children, the right to work. We don't speak about that. What even adoption is very slow. Here you have the percentages, they're only 1 or 0.2% in the advocacy documentation. It is an illustration of a point I'd like to make, that when you look at actors involved in implementing, in working on children's rights, they make choices. They make deliberate choices, what kind of themes they will be working on and what they will not be working on. And we see that in these themes that they are mostly the consensual issues, and also those that correspond to a dominant understanding of childhood that will reach more easily the top of the agenda. Basic needs. Now, who can be against providing children basic needs? So these kind of themes comes. While controversial issues, well, the safe abortion, the right to work. Kids don't have a right to work, don't they? And it will be much more difficult to put them up because they are, well, controversial. And you see that these priority themes have, well, that's Mutar Mukua from the human rights author speaks about the victim savage savior metaphor. I like the firefighter ideology. If we can go out and help them, that's what we're good at, that's what we want to do. So the emergencies theme, that are the themes. And we see also that those who possess greater financial power, social capital, who have the capacity, they have a stronger influence. They can make the agenda. We can ask, why did the committee or why did the General Assembly decide to have optional protocols on the sale of children, armed conflict, and our individual complaints? Well, there was a lot of energy put into these optional protocols by some powerful actors also in the field. And at the end, what we were interested in was also these counter-hegemonic claims, and the right to work for children, the girls under 18 do they have a right to marry? Whoa, even asking the question in a field where we push for age limits is very dangerous. So counter-hegemonic claims, they're really, really marginal. And if there are translators of these, it would be marginal players also. And I will skip my second example because otherwise I'm over time. So I just want to end with this new image. So it is a challenge. I don't know, you remember when I said it, implementing from top to down. And this is then a piece still under construction. So that will be chapter 7. And I'm not at all at chapter 7. I'm just at the very first beginning. So, but it's about what happens is it's not implementation as a one-way thing. It's about translating from languages to others, and it goes two ways. You have children's lived realities that also get translated into international norms. And these international norms, while they are being put into the ground and implemented, they also get interpreted by, well, in my example of my study, it was by international advocates. But I think the same goes also for judges at a national level. For child law clinics, you make choices on what kind of themes you work. I mean, what happens is much more a translation, which I think is a much stronger, or explains better what happens than if you only use the word implementation. So that's I will conclude with this slide. So thank you very much.